Now there are lots of options for properties in CSS. In fact, if we go to W3 Schools and go to the section where it says Learn CSS, here's a tutorial that teaches lots of different topics. You see those on the left. And if you go clear to the bottom, there's a CSS reference. And part of this reference is a list of all the CSS properties. And it's a long list. There's a lot of properties there. You can see them on the left, or you can actually see them in the middle screen as well. But here's a reference to them, and you can look up each individual one. We're not going to learn all of these, but we are going to learn how to use these properties so that you can come back and learn any new property that you want and see how you can add that into a file. Now, new properties come out, and before they are part of the standard, part of the CSS standard, browsers will use them. So browsers will say, oh, we want to try this new style, and it's not part of the standard, so maybe one browser knows it and one doesn't. And in that case, they'll have what are called vendor prefixes. And here are some prefixes for different browsers. You can see the browsers here and what the prefix is for maybe the style property that they know. And here's an example. So here's the selector is article, and then the column -count property, so the column count property has been added 3 times. The first time it has the WebKit prefix, the second time the MOZ prefix, and the third time no prefix at all. So the way that the browser handles this is it starts at the top, and if it knows the property, then it'll apply it. So if you're using the FileZilla and it gets to this WebKit, it won't recognize it because WebKit is for Chrome and Safari, and Firefox won't recognize it. If it doesn't recognize it, it just simply skips it, goes to the next one. This one has the MOZ prefix, and that is for Firefox. So then Firefox will see if it understands this column count, and that will depend on which version of Firefox it is. If it's a version that understands column count, then it will apply it. If it doesn't understand it, then it'll skip it. Then this last one is the general use, and that's if this browser understands the column count. And if it does, it'll use it. If not, it won't. There's a precedence, so CSS precedence. It determines which rule is actually applied. And there's some very specific rules that CSS uses to resolve any differences. Now, if there's not a conflict, so if there are not 2 different style rules that are in conflict, it doesn't matter. All the style rules will be applied. So precedence isn't applied until there's a conflict. And that's where 2 different style rules try to set the same property on the same element. When that happens, then it has to decide, which one do I apply? Because I've got 2 different ones on the same element, I have to decide. Well, the way that it resolves that, one of the ways it does is the style rule that comes later has precedence, and it just really works. It just sets this style rule, then this one, and then it gets to this one. It'll overwrite anything before. So that's how it gets precedence. Another way that it gets precedence is the more specific style rule has precedence. For example, if you're putting a style property on the entire body, that's not very specific. But if you put it on a paragraph, that's more specific. So if you have set the color on the body and set the color on paragraph and they're different, that's a conflict for the paragraph. It'll decide that the paragraph is more specific than the body. So that rule will win. And if there's some text inside the paragraph, like a strong text, and that's set different than the paragraph itself, well, then that section of text is more specific. So that style will take precedence. And that's how you identify more specific style rule. Another thing that style properties do is have inheritance. So they're inherited. So an ancestor, so it's like the CSS is like a tree. Well, HTML is like a tree. And something keeps going inside. So let's just look at the file and talk about what it means to be an ancestor. So here we have an image, and it's inside the header tags. That means that image tag is a child of header. And header is inside body. So header is a child of body. And so body is an ancestor of header. It's also an ancestor of this image. And descendants go the other way. So here's the body, and there's a descendant called the header and a descendant called image. So it uses this family tree terminology when we talk about how elements are nested inside of each other, that they're parents, they're ancestors, they're siblings. So here we have this Li would be a sibling to this Li. And you'll notice that these terms are used over and over again to identify how elements are related to each other. So on inheritance, that means any ancestor could set a property. Well, many of those style properties are inherited. So not all of them. And W3 Schools will tell you whether this property is inherited or not. That's what when it talks about those, it'll say whether they are or not. We can go look at W3 Schools at a property. So let's take display, for example. We open that up and we look down here about the definition, and it says inherited, no. So this property would not be inherited. Just because one ancestor has it doesn't mean that the descendants would have that property. Let's look at another one. So let's look at color and look at its definition. And it says that it is inherited. So if you set the color of the body, that will be inherited by all of its children, by the header, by the paragraph, any of the children within that body, that color property will be inherited. And that's what it means for the descendants would have the same style as the ancestor. Now, if the descendant sets that property, then that would have precedence. So the descendant can override that if they want to. But if it's not overridden, then it's inherited.